You believe you are chasing happiness, but you are only running a loop designed to keep you permanently hungry. This is the great lie whispered into the ear of modern man. That desire is the engine of freedom. It is not. Desire is the shackle forged by the dopamine Demiurge, a parasitic hidden system that demands perpetual seeking, ensuring you never actually arrive. We are high-functioning addicts, slaves to the neurotransmitter of anticipation, convinced that the next click, the next purchase, the next achievement will finally deliver us from the agony of the present moment. It never will. The objective of this system is not your satisfaction. The objective is your continuous predictable motion. The central thesis of your trapped existence is this: freedom is dead, murdered by the perfect alignment of evolutionary wiring and modern technological exploitation. The Demiurge is not a malicious deity. It is far more insidious. It is the operating principle of a material reality designed to monetize the gap between expectation and fulfillment. Dopamine is the cruel currency of this reality. We mistakenly call dopamine the pleasure chemical. That is a dangerous simplification. Dopamine is the seeking chemical. It is the siren call of the potential reward, the drive to investigate the possibility of satisfaction. True pleasure, the warm contentment of having, is handled by other, quieter systems, like the opioid and serotonin pathways. But those systems are passive. They don't demand action. The Demiurge thrives on action, on movement, on the feverish chase. Therefore, it amplifies the seeking signal and systematically devalues the reward signal. Think of the mechanism as a predictive error machine. When you anticipate a reward, dopamine spikes. If the reward is exactly what you expected, the dopamine signal decreases immediately upon acquisition. You reset to baseline, but if the reward is slightly better than expected, dopamine spikes higher, reinforcing the action that led to the win. If the reward is less than expected, dopamine plummets, creating a frantic drive to correct the error. The modern digital world, the ultimate playground of the Demiurge, has learned to perfectly calibrate this system. It has mastered the art of delivering rewards that are just below the threshold of true satisfaction, maintaining a perpetual state of less than expected. The algorithm ensures you are always hunting, always correcting, always swiping, convinced that the next piece of content will finally justify the time you have spent. This is not freedom. This is a behavioral treadmill calibrated for maximum speed. We are watching the death of sustained attention and the elevation of mere potential. The Demiurge has replaced deep, meaningful work, which demands tolerance for delayed and uncertain rewards, with immediate, shallow stimulation. Why build a cathedral that takes 50 years when you can get a guaranteed dopamine hit from a 50-second video? Our neurochemistry has been successfully outcompeted by engineered novelty. If you find yourself nodding along, realizing that the architecture of your life is defined by fleeting digital ghosts and the pervasive anxiety of missing out, you are recognizing the chains. If you are tired of the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about control, and if you are ready to look straight into the true dark architecture of your own motivation, then subscribe right now and join the few who choose awareness over programmed contentment. This Demiurge, this master of anticipation, weaponizes scarcity and novelty. Evolution favored the organism that was relentlessly curious, the one that kept seeking food or shelter even after finding a small supply. That relentless curiosity, once a survival mechanism, is now a vulnerability. Modern industry is simply exploiting an ancient biological flaw. It doesn't sell you a product. It sells you a promise of a future emotional state that is, by design, unreachable. We buy the clothes, the status, the experience, not for the physical object itself, but for the temporary dopamine spike of anticipation we get during the transaction and the brief social validation that follows. But the moment the package arrives, the moment the transaction is complete, the Demiurge resets the clock. The desire immediately transfers to the next item, the next conquest, the next illusory fulfillment. You are perpetually climbing a ladder whose rungs dissolve beneath your feet. The truly terrifying realization is that the Demiurge is an internal puppet master operating under the guise of free will. We defend our desires as sacred expressions of self, when in fact they are often perfectly predictable responses to external cues that have been painstakingly optimized for maximum behavioral yield. Consider the default state of modern anxiety. It is not the fear of immediate danger, but the constant low-grade hum of unfulfilled seeking. We are perpetually waiting for the notification, the approval, the sign that we have done enough to earn the temporary silence of the Demiurge. But the silence is temporary, and the demands are infinite. This is the trap of the contemporary self. Believing your compulsions are your personality. The first step toward breaking free is acknowledging that most of the decisions you believe you made were simply choices presented to you within a carefully controlled environment, designed to benefit the architect of the loop, not the captive within it. The architect of the loop succeeds because the ultimate casualty of the Demiurge is not our bank account, but our internal mechanism for self-validation. When every action, every purchase, every pursuit is framed by external metrics, by the approval of others, by the quantifiable metric of status, or by the temporary pleasure of anticipation, we lose the muscular fortitude required to simply exist without performance. This is why we suffer so acutely. We have been trained to mistake the frantic act of seeking for the profound state of being. The modern self is inherently fragile because it is built upon the shifting sands of comparative judgment. You are not only chasing an unreachable ideal of contentment, you are doing so while simultaneously being exposed to billions of hyper-optimized, curated representations of other people's alleged fulfillments. The Demiurge is no longer just whispering its demands. It has handed you an infinite mirror reflecting only what you lack. This creates the fundamental cognitive dissonance of the 21st century, the profound sense of identity diffusion that results when the self is merely a collage of outsourced desires. We are desperately trying to unify these fragmented external approvals into a coherent person, but the pieces never fit because the external world is engineered for rapid obsolescence. The clothes that signaled status last year signal desperation this year. The experience that brought validation yesterday is forgotten in the flood of today's content. The suffering is the constant, humiliating need to re-earn our right to exist by acquiring the next metric. If you find yourself nodding along to this brutal truth, if you refuse to let the algorithm define your intellectual consumption, then you understand the crucial necessity of carving out intellectual space free from the noise. If you want more of the uncomfortable clarity the Demiurge tries desperately to bury, then subscribe now. This is a commitment not just to a channel, but to the disciplined act of looking closer at the reality we inhabit. The psychological consequence of this external dependency is the profound atrophy of internal validation. We no longer possess the vocabulary to define success or contentment in purely non-transactional terms. Ask a contemporary person why they are unhappy, and the answer almost always involves a metric they haven't achieved yet, a deficiency in their social presentation, or a comparison they haven't won. Happiness has become the deferred reward for successfully executing the Demiurge's program. But the Demiurge is a cruel accountant. It issues infinite debt and accepts no currency but future striving. The deepest psychological wound is inflicted when we begin to confuse our necessary suffering, the inevitable friction of growth and life, with the unnecessary torment of constant seeking. We internalize the belief that anxiety is simply the fuel for striving, rather than recognizing it as a systemic signal that we are operating against our own core stability. We have inverted the natural order. Instead of using desire as a tool to navigate immediate needs, we have become the tool of desire, leveraging our own deepest emotional needs, for belonging, for competence, for meaning, to perpetuate the cycle of consumption and performance. The modern person sacrifices the precious, quiet dignity of the present moment for the loud, anxious promise of a future moment that will supposedly justify the sacrifice. This promise is the ultimate psychological bait, because the future moment never carries the anticipated weight. It simply becomes the new, unsatisfying present. This endless deferral of authentic living is the true cost of confusing consumption with identity. The cost of this psychological displacement is nowhere clearer than in the modern economy of performance, where it is not enough to simply achieve. You must publicly document the excruciating process of achievement. We do not merely sacrifice the present moment. We film the sacrifice. The life narrative is no longer structured by memory or meaning, but by the relentless logic of the pitch deck, trajectory, scaling, and demonstrable suffering. The identity becomes a perpetually updating LinkedIn profile, a highlight reel of exhaustion presented as aspiration. Consider the contemporary ideal of the optimized person. They are always in beta, never finished, perpetually measuring their own unhappiness against the perceived efficiency of their striving. The irony that escapes us is this. The moment the goal is achieved, the body transformed, the financial milestone hit, the project launched, The camera stays rolling, not to celebrate the cessation of effort, but to immediately capture the launch of the next, harder goal. The victory lap is shorter than the announcement of the next battle. This is not ambition. This is psychological Stockholm syndrome. We have fallen in love with our captor, the demand for infinite documented output. We have convinced ourselves that the relentless, buzzing anxiety in our chests is the essential fuel for life, rather than the systemic degradation of the chassis. It is the noise we mistake for music. This deep dive into the pathology of performance is exactly the kind of analysis that gets sanitized, softened, or suppressed by the platforms built entirely upon those very performance metrics. If you recognize the necessity of this kind of unfiltered, uncomfortable clarity, and you want to ensure that challenging, deep content continues to be made and pushed into the algorithmic current, then take a moment and subscribe now. Your focused support is the critical distinction between noise and signal. When the self is constantly leveraged for external performance, it inevitably loses its internal authority. We surrender the final, crucial ability to self-validate, becoming entirely dependent on the reflection provided by the external metric, the Demiurge's distorting mirror. If you cannot define your worth outside of the transactional context, outside of the paycheck, the follower count, or the compliment, then you have outsourced your core self. And what happens when the market dips, the platform changes its algorithm, or the external approval evaporates? The self collapses, because it was never constructed upon its own foundation. This leads to the chronic, gnawing self-doubt that defines the modern successful person. They are deeply suspicious of any moment of stillness or contentment, convinced that peace is merely the signal of stagnation, the first stage of competitive decline. We have been expertly trained to believe that the absence of crippling anxiety is failure, when in truth, the absence of that unnecessary systemic agitation is the prerequisite for genuine competence and sustainable action. The Demiurge does not sell us products. It sells us a state of perpetual emergency. This emergency mandates the worship of speed, the elevation of velocity over direction, and the belief that merely existing at a high tempo equates to meaningful progress. We have forgotten that depth requires slowness. Profundity is inherently inefficient. The most valuable insights, the most robust forms of self-knowledge, the deepest connections with others, all of these refuse to be rushed. They demand incubation, silence, and the tolerance for unproductive time. Yet, the current psychological infrastructure is designed precisely to eliminate these necessary fallow periods. Every empty minute is flagged as waste. Every moment of genuine thought is interrupted by a notification demanding attention, pulling the focus back to the transactional world of metrics and immediate response. The tragedy is that we now actively facilitate our own destruction of depth. We anxiously refresh the screen that tells us we are not enough, confusing the frantic search for meaning with the actual discovery of it. We are addicted to the very system that guarantees our permanent dissatisfaction. The highest price we pay is the erosion of self-trust, the insidious belief that we are incapable of generating internal meaning and must perpetually siphon it from the exhausted, polluted well of external validation. The consequence is a life lived permanently in reaction, a life of motion without movement. The ultimate psychic consequence of this externally validated life is the internalization of the void. We cease to generate genuine internal momentum. Instead, we become specialists in psychological triage, managing the wounds inflicted by the very system we serve. We are convinced that the frantic maintenance of our external profile, the endless curation of performance metrics, the optimized demonstration of relentless availability, is the true work of adulthood. This is a profound, tragic confusion. We have mistaken the shadow for the substance, and the necessary administrative overhead of survival for the actual purpose of living. The system, being ruthlessly intelligent, observes the inevitable crash that follows this hyper-optimization, and instead of dismantling the engine of burnout, it simply sells us the optimized oil change. It introduces the cruelest, most insidious societal lie of the century, the myth of balance. We are told that we can, through disciplined scheduling and the adoption of marketable mindfulness practices, achieve a sustainable equilibrium between the demands of a cancerous, perpetually accelerating economy and the desperate needs of the human soul. This is not balance, it is systemic lubrication. Self-care has been weaponized and repackaged as yet another metric of competitive optimization, the recovery period required to return to the machine faster, stronger, and less complainingly. We are encouraged to buy expensive candles, take luxurious baths, and engage in specific forms of yoga, all designed not to fundamentally challenge the architecture of our exhaustion, but to efficiently process the cortisol spikes so we can meet the next deadline. The Demiurge recognizes that a completely burned-out worker is an unproductive worker, so it offers controlled release valves, ensuring the pressure never drops low enough for revolutionary thought to germinate, but just low enough to keep the gears turning. If you recognize this analysis as more than just cynical, if you are tired of the comforting, superficial self-help lies offered by those who fear the true, difficult diagnosis of systemic control, then now is the time to commit to the depth required to face it. Take a moment to subscribe, because this space exists specifically to dismantle these profitable illusions and confront the real complexity of the modern psyche without flinching or offering easy platitudes. We refuse to sell you optimized recovery. We offer radical clarity. The lie of balance necessitates the destruction of genuine moral weight. If all problems are merely personal scheduling conflicts, then no problem is truly structural or philosophical. By privatizing burnout, the system annihilates the possibility of collective, deep introspection. We are so busy managing our personal stress portfolios, our sleep trackers, our gratitude journals, our intermittent fasting schedules, that we lack the necessary distance and stillness to ask the one question that truly matters. Is this life serious? Seriousness is not dourness or depression. It is the philosophical commitment to reality, the recognition that some things, death, love, justice, are non-negotiable and demand sustained, slow contemplation. The worship of speed makes seriousness impossible. We become philosophically lightweight, incapable of holding the gravity of profound truths, because our attention span has been engineered for the transaction, not the transcendence. We mistake moral panic, the quick, reactive outrage demanded by the news cycle, for moral fortitude, which requires patience, research, and the painful willingness to tolerate ambiguity. We are conditioned to react instantaneously, because if we wait, if we allow silence to enter the conversation, we might discover that our carefully constructed identity, built entirely on reactivity and external praise, is resting on a vacuum. This is the final and greatest victory of the system. It has not just enslaved our labor, it has colonized our interiority, convincing us that the only safe place to stand is within the churning, noisy center of its own manufactured chaos. This acceptance of manufactured chaos is not a weakness of character. It is a desperate, unconscious survival strategy rooted in ontological poverty. We choose the visible, solvable, measurable anxiety, the stress of the inbox, the pressure of the workout routine, because it successfully masks the invisible, terrifying, and unsolvable anxiety of existential dread. We prefer the anesthetic of busyness to the excruciating silence required to truly examine our foundational premises. If we stopped moving, if the noise suddenly cut out, we would be left facing the raw, terrifying fact of our own finitude, the terrifying freedom of radical choice, and the unbearable weight of responsibility for the trajectory of our single, unrepeatable life. The system, in its profound genius, understands that fear of meaninglessness is far more potent than fear of poverty. Therefore, it provides an infinite supply chain of substitute seriousness, minor emergencies, personalized improvement projects, and a constant demanding performance identity. The optimized self is the perfect slave, perpetually busy, always attempting to fix a defect, physical, mental, financial, that the market created, and crucially, always confusing motion for progress. We internalize the belief that if we are suffering, it must be because we are not optimizing hard enough, not because the structure we inhabit is inherently pathological. We confuse the struggle for alignment, the painful effort to fit our square, complex selves into the round, simple whole of corporate expectation, with a genuine struggle for self-knowledge. This confusion is why we embrace the daily psychological torture. We are trying to prove our worth by demonstrating our utility, a trade that always ends in spiritual bankruptcy. If you find yourself consistently preferring the difficult analysis that explains the architecture of your anxiety over the self-help industry's quick fixes and comforting lies, if you value the painful truth over the optimized illusion, then I urge you to subscribe right now. It is your commitment that guarantees we can continue building this library of deep, uncomfortable clarity, refusing the shallow consensus and supporting content that cannot be made profitable within the current attention economy. The final and most devastating psychological consequence of this colonized interiority is the complete loss of inner calibration. When all attention is external, focused on feedback loops, metrics, and validation, the self ceases to possess an internal gyroscope. We no longer know how to distinguish between genuine, necessary moral pain and purely manufactured social friction. We become masters of performative feeling. We don't feel grief, we display it according to accepted norms. We don't hold ethical stances, we signal them for social capital. Our emotions are not internal experiences to be processed, they are external currency to be spent. This externalization of the self makes us profoundly manipulable. When we are disconnected from our own authentic, slow-burning moral convictions, the kind that take years of quiet reflection to forge, we default to the quickest available script. And the quickest available script is always written by the entity that profits most from our immediate reactive outrage. We mistake the intensity of a manufactured reaction for the depth of a meaningful commitment, which is the definition of philosophical juvenilia. We exist in a state of perpetual moral high alert, but possess zero moral fortitude, oscillating wildly between extreme righteousness and debilitating self-doubt, because neither emotion originates from a deep, settled inner core. We are the ultimate consumers, not just of goods and services, but of prefabricated, disposable identities and emotions. The path back to seriousness, therefore, begins not with political action or even social protest, but with the radical, dangerous act of internal secession. It requires disconnecting the self from the validation matrix and tolerating the terrifying emptiness that ensues. It means learning to sit in the silence and hear the terrifying truth, that there is no script, that the chaos is real, and that the only thing standing between you and the void is the integrity of your own slow one consciousness. This radical internal secession is not an exercise in philosophical abstraction. It is the single most dangerous economic decision a modern person can make, because the entire structure of the network society is designed to penalize silence and enforce participation. The system does not merely want your time, it wants to rent your interiority back to you, packaging self-worth as a subscription service. To refuse to engage in the constant performance of self is to immediately face the threat of irrelevance, which for the externally calibrated mind feels like death itself. The moment you step off the merry-go-round of immediate outrage and validation, you are confronted by the terrifying void of non-signal. If you refuse to use your emotions as currency, the market assigns you a value of 0. This is why few ever attempt the journey back. They fear that their silence will be mistaken for guilt, their complexity for hypocrisy, and their slow, nuanced thought for outright treason against the prevailing consensus. They fear being blacklisted from the social credit ledger that determines access to jobs, housing, and social inclusion. The horrifying truth is demonstrated daily in the ritualistic destruction of reputation. Observe the mechanism of a public shaming. When a person is suddenly deemed morally deficient, often for a transgression that is trivial, old, or misinterpreted, the collective reaction is not one of solemn justice or measured critique. It is a rapid, intense, self-preserving panic. People rush, en masse, to participate in the moral stoning, not because they are deeply committed to the specific offense, but because their non-participation is an admission of their own potential guilt. They must display the intensity of their manufactured moral disgust to purchase temporal safety for themselves. The outrage is not aimed at the target. It is a high-speed transaction aimed at securing their own position in the matrix. They are not judging the accused. They are merely demonstrating the fidelity of their inner calibration mechanism to the external powers. We watch careers vaporize and reputations dissolve in minutes, not because we have suddenly become a society of deeply principled moral philosophers, but because we have become a society of psychic cowards who understand that performative cruelty is the cheapest form of self-defense. This manufactured intensity is the ultimate proof that the inner gyroscope is gone, replaced by a weather vane that only points to the loudest social wind. This is the content that forces you to stare into that terrifying void, the content the algorithms suppress because it interferes with profitable rage cycles. If you find yourself nodding, if you recognize the cost of thinking slowly in a world addicted to speed, consider subscribing right now, because only your support keeps this kind of deep, uncompromising analysis alive. The act of internal secession requires cultivating what the ancients called ataraxia, but filtered through the acidic reality of modernity. It is not simple tranquility, but the cold, disciplined refusal to allow the outside world to dictate the terms of your emotional landscape. It means watching the storms of outrage pass by without volunteering your own internal resources to fuel them. It demands that you develop moral convictions that are so deeply rooted in self-knowledge and tested experience that they are entirely unintelligible to the externalized self. When your convictions are slow-won, you cannot be rushed into adopting a new, disposable identity every Tuesday, nor can you be shamed out of a belief simply because it has become inconvenient. The ultimate consequence of living without this internal center is not merely personal anxiety, but civil collapse. A society composed of externally calibrated, emotionally liquid individuals has no capacity for serious, long-term collective action, only for instantaneous, self-consuming emotional spasms. We cease to be citizens capable of forging a durable political reality and become mere focus groups, responding predictably to stimuli. The path back begins with the terrifying recognition that the script you were handed is designed to keep you profitable and docile, and that the greatest danger is not missing out on the next trending outrage, but missing out on the brief, fragile opportunity you have to author your own soul. The choice is stark, difficult, and mandatory. Endure the terrifying isolation that comes from defying the external matrix and risk being misunderstood, irrelevant, and lonely, or remain perpetually connected, perpetually frantic, and perpetually enslaved to an identity you didn't even choose. The verdict is this: if your moral life depends on external approval, you possess no moral life at all. You possess only compliance. True sovereignty lies not in demanding change from the world, but in refusing to let the world change the essential, settled core of who you are. The work of internal secession is brutal, it is slow, and it is the only rebellion left that actually matters. If you are ready to undertake that difficult, quiet, internal work and join a community committed to fighting the colonization of the mind, then subscribe now. The final, heartbreaking truth is this: we are not failing because the external pressures are too great. We are failing because we have systematically discarded the very machinery required to withstand them. We have outsourced our conscience to algorithms and our courage to crowds. The greatest illusion of our time is the belief that connectivity equals intimacy, or that external visibility equals internal reality. It does not. It is merely a sophisticated mechanism for extracting your attention and your emotional labor, leaving you hollowed out and optimized for predictable consumption. The real tragedy is not that you missed the opportunity to become famous, but that you missed the opportunity to become truly, irrevocably anonymous, free from the constant surveillance of expectation. The only way to stop serving as raw material for someone else's profit is to become unquantifiable, unmarketable, and ultimately, internally whole. This is not a philosophy you can tweet. It is a way of life you must forge alone, in the silence that the Matrix fears most. The work of internal secession is brutal, it is slow, and it is the only rebellion left that actually matters. If you are ready to undertake that difficult, quiet, internal work and join a community committed to fighting the colonization of the mind, then subscribe now. The final, crushing verdict is that we are not heading toward liberation, but toward absolute optimization, where every erratic human impulse has been smoothed out into marketable compliance. Your failure will not be dramatic, but a gradual, silent disappearance, where you look in the mirror and only see the aggregated data points others collected, and you realize you died long ago, replaced by a perfectly responsive avatar. The only meaningful freedom left is the painful, difficult refusal to participate in your own erasure. So choose your poison: the brutal honesty of internal rebellion and the discomfort of self-confrontation, or the slow, numbing ache of becoming a perfectly compliant ghost. The victory isn't in destroying the Matrix. The victory is recognizing its false gravity and building a citadel of self that it can never breach. If you are prepared to choose the path of self-ownership, if you are ready to stand firm against the algorithms designed to dissolve your autonomy, then subscribe now. Join the few who still believe that the ultimate victory lies not in changing the world, but in refusing to let the world change the essential